Good afternoon. It's Lee Cassidy, and this is my keynote session. It's slightly different to what you've seen so far because it's a bit more around people and process rather than talking specifically about technology. What I'd like to do is just share my screen and go through a few little slides talking about some of the things and the challenges that we face as we move towards a digital transformation of our organization. So if we think about some of the areas that have now become effectively software defined or digital services, and these are some that we utilize today while we're thinking about how we can actually digitize our own business. So if we consider the way we fly, majority of things are automated now, and it's a key thing from that check-in process, identification of the individuals through to the boarding process. All of it is completely automated these days. And also there's linkages to things like baggage check-in and tying those that baggage to the individual who's flying on the aircraft. There's also, the financial services side of things. If you consider that we've actually got a lot of things going on in that financial services space now, because most people are using their phones to make payments, about 50%. So things like Apple Pay have changed the way that we think about, transactions financially, especially in this world of non-touch, where we're starting to use larger payments. And Apple Pay allows us to go beyond the current limits that we have with NFC type devices on cards to actually pay up to whatever amount the shopping is that week. There are a lot of other organisations like BNSF are using IoT to determine what's happening with the actual trains and measure vibration and things before they have a failure on one of the hubs on one of the trains. BMW are understanding a lot more about their cars by using IoT data and pulling that back. Tesla, another one that are driving heavily in that space, if you pardon the pun. But as we move forward, we're going to see a lot more of automation, things like driverless shopping delivery. A lot of organizations are already trialing this in the US and also in the UK. But also when we look at booking a holiday, so Carnival Cruises, they're using a lot of IoT and also payment type systems, through things like smartwatches, rather than using plastic cards with magnetic strips like people used to use in the past. So some big changes in how we're actually doing things. But also, if we look at the old and while we move into the new, we've got a lot of new problems. One is the proliferation of the different tools and technologies. There are so many different platforms we could be utilizing, so many different types of development and automation tools for that. It's become a real area for people to use pipeline-based systems and automation. The run times that we're utilizing to run our workloads are changing dramatically, and a large move towards containerization. But also how we operate those systems is getting very complicated now, with all the different systems capturing logs, understanding what's happening from a intrusion detection and safety side of things. But also then we could end up with a situation where a lot of the tools and technology we utilize become siloed, and we end up with a situation we used to have with old technologies where each application was its own silo. We could end up in a situation where our security tools and technologies hold us into a particular silo as well. But things are constantly evolving as well, especially on the security and compliance. The regulations are being enforced around PCI much more stringently these days. I know we're not in the US, but IPA, or the protection of patient records, is quite important to a lot of organizations in the UK as well as in the US. But also people are trying to utilize ISO 27001 and other of these to make sure that they're compliant from a standards perspective from a security side. But there are a lot of organizations that are actually driving innovation and in that operation. Things like BBC, Z Factory, Nike are doing some really big things in this space. So the traditional approach is dead, really. So we are changing the way that we do things. And a lot of the old ways where we'd have custom integration, between different components within our infrastructure, doing log analytics and many other things are changing. And it actually makes it very expensive if we take the old way of doing things, and also very inflexible when we move into this new world. It's also very difficult to stop vendor lock-in, because old technologies, even as we move into the new era, we could end up locked into a particular vendor and a particular service. And these were spoken about earlier. I believe Boris was talking about public cloud and how you could end up locked into a particular public cloud if you've utilized just their technology. And also, we could end up with a situation where the services are too rigid for what we're trying to achieve. Some of them are providing just security and not compliance and many of the other things that we need, where we need to actually manage the risk. And a lot of them are also manual and also rely on humans, where we get human error. And that's where I believe that automation is going to be a big part of what we do, because automation will allow us to ensure that each activity is consistent. So every time we see this particular problem, we deal with it in the same way, and we don't have humans in there slowing it down and also causing issues by human error. So let's think about this new world. There's a lot of people in the room. If you think about it, we've got the development people, we've got the people who are actually doing the operations of the compute platform, we've got the networking and storage people, we've got these security people sat outside of that, understanding what's happening at the firewall and potentially looking at things internally within the systems as well through IDS and IPS based systems. But everything is separate, and we're all blaming each other for where the problem resides. And because of that, it can take a long time to actually identify and resolve an issue. There are also lots of blind spots here. So there are lots of areas that we can't see. We can miss them. Yeah, and a quote from Mark Andreessen that software is eating the world. Software is becoming a really big thing, because it's driving all of these services. Everything's becoming software defined or software, orchestrated. So we need to make sure that we get it right and we're not missing anything when we do that. But one thing to think about when we look from a security and a compliance perspective, that we tend to have this cyclic activity where we start off where we've got a point where we've got a level of security, but it may not be as compliant as we require. We do an audit and we identify by bringing external auditors where we need to be, and we have a set of activities we need to follow to resolve that issue, the gap analysis between where we are and where we need to be. We then spend time and effort and money fixing that. We get to the point where now we're actually compliant, but gradually over time, because we're not monitoring it until the next audit comes along, we can drift away from that compliance. And it could be lots of different things. Configuration settings, it could be the use of different images and things, but we end up in a situation that we actually drift away from that compliance, and that opens us up for risk of attack, and also it gives us more work next time we get the audit to actually get recovered back to where we should be. The cost of failure is massive. And if we look at the breaches that have happened just last year, 143 million Americans have had their data taken from, certain exploits. But we hear of them every day. There are recent ones with Microsoft. There's been lots of data that seems to have been taken from Facebook. But there are lots of these escapes where people have broken in and taken information. It could be personal information that could be used for identity type activity. It could be financial data, credit card information that could be used fraudulently as well. So these are happening all the time. And one of the big problems with it, it's not only the loss, it's both the reputation and also potentially fines that you could get. And with the latest fines that are coming through from the European Union, which will be taken up in the UK, even though we've left the European Union, could be very large. We're looking at between 5 and 10% of your annual turnover. It could be a fine, but the reputational piece is much greater than that. A lot of organizations have done surveys, and people are saying around about 44% of the population would actually move service provider if they found that their data had been exposed by that service provider by not doing adequate security. So the only way that we can actually do this is innovation, not adding more operating and security tools to it. It's the innovation of the way we do things that makes a big difference. And the commonest approach is to set up something like a SOC, so a Security Operations Center. And this is only really for the very large organizations. Small organizations don't have both the skills and the capabilities and the resources to build a SOC. You also then need to have some kind of security management platform that can actually look across all of your entry points and look at a variety of different behavioral patterns to understand if there's an issue and feed that data into the SOC. People also utilize intrusion detection systems so we can actually identify that a person's come through a particular point where they shouldn't have, or we can actually create honeypots and things that would identify if we've got an intrusion. And there are also other tooling that we could utilize to actually make this work from a variety of enterprise and also open source organizations. People are also utilizing some of these technologies such as Splunk, which was quoted in a couple of the breakout sessions and also in one of the keynotes. And Splunk is great at a small scale. It's cost effective, but as you increase in size, the costs become massive and the infrastructure required to utilize it becomes massive. But one of the biggest problems is identifying the problem, because you have so many logs coming in and so many alerts. It's very difficult to identify what's important, what's not important. There are other technology like logarithm and checkpoint have these capabilities too. Also, you've got to consider the commitment that you're going to do with this. It's going to take a long time. So to build out a SOC, a SIEM platform, implement IDS, IPS, and other security tooling is going to take a long time. A lot of organizations, it takes them 6 to 12 months as a minimum. And really, when you're moving down a digital transformation route, you don't really want to have to wait 6 to 12 months to get your security in place to be able to achieve it. It's also very expensive and also quite inflexible. So if you're going down this digital transformation route, agility is really important. Being able to actually change your code and deliver through your DevOps teams quickly, but also securely, is really important. So if your security platform is inflexible, it makes it very difficult for you to deploy new applications and new services to your customers. Also, what happens when you get to the end of the contract? How do you move on? How do you replace what you had before? And a lot of these things are purely security. They don't offer any other capabilities such as compliance and monitoring and auditing. So our view of the world is to actually think about this where we've got the operations covered, looking at the platform that we're utilizing, because different platforms have got different needs. We're also looking at configuration and compliance together, because it's really important to understand what the actual configuration is for your services as you deploy them, to ensure that certain services within the virtual machine or the container are not enabled, to ensure that you don't have a risk of attack through those. And also looking at vulnerabilities, depending on which technology you're utilizing, that you're at the right patch level for that virtual machine, that container, and the runtime activity that it's going to be used for. We also need some kind of SIEM and IDS capabilities so we can actually identify and do something about those attacks, and then integrate with other services that we require that we're not delivering with the core services. So it's really important that we actually do that. And what we can do then is try and reduce the amount of security incidents we have, but also automate the resolution, because automation gives us two things. One, much more rapid response to an issue, and also a consistent response, because automation follows the same path every time, looks at what's happened, and we can ensure that we've resolved it. But platform and security also needs experts. So we need people to ensure that we've got that. And I think that's one of the biggest issues a lot of organizations are facing. They don't have the internal skills and experience, and the resources they need are very expensive resources. So it's a real challenge for them. So what we're trying to do, though, is achieve security compliance, mitigate risks. We're trying to be agile in the development of our workloads and our service as we go forward, but not at the compromise in security. The other thing we need to do is deliver quality of service. So making sure that that we actually deliver the best service to our end user customers and also our internal users, because we sometimes forget our internal users are just as important for us as our external customers. We also need to try and validate the actual architecture that we use in the environment, because as we move forward, that environment might need to change depending on what we're trying to deploy and how we're deploying it. As we move towards more software-defined infrastructure and also utilizing more container and public cloud infrastructure, things are going to change with the environment that we're utilizing. And from that, we need to also ensure that we're looking at it from a compliance and security perspective as well. Another area that we need to do is reduce the actual service costs. So looking at what our costs are and ensuring those don't accelerate, because a lot of organizations have found when they've moved into a public cloud environment that the costs are actually much greater than they budgeted. A number of years ago, say 3 to 5 years ago, a lot of organizations, once they'd actually covered their first year, they were finding they were between 1.5 to 2 times the budget that they'd actually budgeted for, and it was a real challenge for them in that public cloud space. So being able to validate and understand what your costs are is quite an important one. We're also looking to ensure that we're eliminating vendor lock-in, because if we end up stuck in a particular vendor's software or hardware or cloud service platform, it's going to be very difficult for us going forward to be able to be masters of our own destiny as we go through this digital transformation journey to the first stage. But what will happen is we'll continue to be reevaluating our digital transformation position and moving forward as services and also technology advances, because we're always going to be looking to innovate, and it's quite important we don't end up in a situation where we're actually locked into a particular vendor for either a product or a service. We need to also focus on our core business. So we recommend that a lot of organizations focus on what they can do, and what they can do then is use organizations like Tactile and many others to actually deliver on what they require for this digital transformation journey. But we also need to see organizations to embrace this new terminology of DevSecOps. We've all heard of DevOps, where we're actually moving towards operations within development, but we need to look at integration between development, operations, and security, because we don't want a gap between them. So as workloads move out of development into production, they end up having issues because configuration or particular services aren't correct. And it's really important that we actually unify all of those services together to get a most efficient, effective, and secure digital transformation journey. So the key things we're looking to achieve, though, is one, to prevent a break into the environment, so someone intruding. We're also looking to detect any of them, and we're also looking then to respond to any of those activities as quickly as possible, and if possible, automated. So what is real compliance? And what real compliance is away from that cyclic event we talked about earlier in the session, but actually a continual configuration management process. So we understand exactly how our systems are configured at all times, and we can identify any configurations that could put us at risk. Also, any configuration that could put the performance or availability at risk as well. It's not always from a security perspective. We also need to be able to continuously audit and do remediation on the system, because that audit process only allows us to then put things back in place when we've actually going to move it away from our compliance. So understanding it continually helps us keep in line. But remediation and dealing with that situation is just as important. We also need to be alerted to any non-compliance, and that could be in any area. It could be in the development side, it could be in operations, it could be as we move from an on-premise to a cloud environment. A number of our speakers have talked about hybrid environments, and one of the issues you could have is that you're completely secure in your on-premise environment, but as you move that workload, especially a container workload, from your on-premise environment over into a public cloud environment, you can end up with a compliance escape. So you end up with a situation that either the configuration or the image or something else could be breaking your compliance. So it's really important with PCI, that you're compliant, but also in any environment, you need to ensure you've got the highest level of security you can. We also need to automate enforcement of policy. So it's pointless having everything where we need to remediate manually. So every time a workload is released and it's got the wrong image, wrong configuration or something, that we're alerted and people have to intervene manually and make configuration changes. We need to enforce a policy. We need to say, that workload cannot go into production because it's got the wrong image. That workload cannot go into production because it's got particular services that we don't have in production enabled in it at the moment. Things like SSH, FTP, those kind of services that might be useful in a development setting, but when we move into production, we don't want those enabled. And also, we need to be able to see this quickly. So having dashboards and reporting is really important for us. We need also a central point to be able to set those rules, that configuration. So we specify what we want for our configuration, and also that we can integrate things like standard compliance, things like PCI, ISO 27001, and our own bespoke requirements into that environment to make sure that everything is automated, everything is also forced compliance to make sure that we don't go against those and we don't break the standards, but also we can actually validate against those standards as well and identify areas that we need to make changes, because it could be that we're integrating PCI into our environment where we've never done credit card processing before, and it's something we need to do new. We need to look at the systems and see what we need to do to meet those standards. That alert enforcement is really important. So we need real-time identification of non-compliance. So if someone's forced something to happen manually or something in the system we've not really accounted for, we need to be able to see that quickly and deal with it quickly. That dashboard will allow us to have a single view across all non-compliance wherever it resides, whether that's in a virtual machine, whether that's sat in a container, whether it's on-premise in a public cloud or a second or third public cloud, because we see organizations in the future utilizing multiple cloud providers to get either cost-effective services, because we'll see differentiated services between public cloud providers, or we can see some real benefits around keeping certain services together because of specific requirements for them. But we need to be able to trigger that automatic enforcement to deal with it and remediate, and also bring us back to a compliant state and understand if we're back in that compliant state. Because sometimes the issue is we've got an alert, we know we're not compliant, but we don't understand when we've actually moved back into compliance. So that confirmation that we're back in compliance is really important to us. Also, we need a good visibility of our security position at all times. We need to understand what's happening. That SOC is pointless if we don't actually understand what's actually happening around us. We need to be able to do threat detection, identify if there are vulnerabilities. We need to be able to aggregate all the information that's coming in and focus on the things that are really important to us, because if we've got too many pieces of information, like most humans, we can't process them. So things like AI and automation are becoming really important in this space. I know a couple of sessions talked about AI ops. The security side is just as important in this, using AI within machine learning to look at behavioral patterns and changes within security as well. We need to also look at aggregation, because one issue in a particular area could actually throw up many alerts for us. We need to be able to aggregate those alerts to understand exactly what's caused that problem, so we can focus on dealing with the situation as quickly as possible. Indexing and analysis is really important. And again, we had Eric Jan Fransen talking earlier about the importance of quick indexing for organizations. If you've got a very large Splunk database that's capturing all your logs and it's really slow indexing, it's going to be difficult for you to identify a problem quickly. So it's really important that you can aggregate and index those so the analysis can be done really quickly. And again, this could be from multiple sources. It could be on-premise equipment and infrastructure and security services. It could also be things within your public cloud environments, because we could have multiples of them. But we need to be looking for intrusion as well. So we need to be able to detect those intrusions and deal with them quickly. Also identify anomalies, because sometimes the intrusion is so difficult to detect. Sometimes it's easier to see the anomaly. So if something's changing that we didn't see before, a particular port's opened on a particular workload, there's been some changes in file sizes and things on a particular machine which is out of the ordinary. So again, machine learning and AI are going to help us really identify those anomalies, those behavioral changes within our systems, so we can actually identify where problems exist. But also file integrity is really important to us. And this comes into a couple of things I heard earlier in some of the breakout sessions. Ross Cooper-Smith was talking about what happens when people actually come in and do ransomware attacks, where they actually take over machines and they encrypt files to take a ransom from you. And commonly what they'll do is attack your backup and recovery capability first to ensure you can't just go back to a previous snapshot and recover yourself really quickly from that. So understanding the contents, the permissions, the ownership, the attributes, and by user and application of those files is really important. And understanding the changes. So if we're seeing changes of ownership, changes of attributes that shouldn't happen, it shows us there are issues within our systems. And it's definitely a requirement for PCI compliance in the UK, as well as some of the other things like PCI and HIPAA type compliance that we see for patient records. I'm going to stop there because I'm running out of time. I've got quite a lot of slides I put together for this, and I didn't know how quickly I was going to get through them. But we've got our next breakout session starting in 3 minutes. So what I'll do is just drop my slides off and bring up our sessions that we've got. So we've only got one breakout session going now. The Diamante guys are not going to do theirs because they've covered majority of that they had in their session anyway. So it's a bit pointless to do that. So the breakout session we've got is Sean Myers, who's going to cover off some really interesting pieces around SQL Server. And what Sean has forgotten about SQL Server will be much more than I ever learned about SQL Server. And the utilization of a very specialized way of accessing SQL Server storage data within Tintri can really give you a much higher performance, much greater availability, but also much more granularity in the control and performance of those databases. So what I'd like everybody to do is jump over to the sessions and join Sean Myers for what I believe is going to be a great presentation, and I'm going to jump over there as well. But if anybody's got any questions about what I've covered around compliance and risk management, quite happy to speak to anybody after the session or another day, and we can cover that off. Thank you very much.